Manyabu Kechamalea tu Itaiwai. Hi everyone, happy Thursday. Today we're breaking down remarks made by J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, at a Turning Point USA event in Oxford, Mississippi, yesterday, October 29th, 2025. He spoke about Christianity, abortion, and so-called civilization, but his version of history included claims about indigenous peoples that needs to be challenged. Let's take a closer look. Vance, appearing before a college audience in Oxford, Mississippi, delivered remarks touching on pro-life issues, Western Christian civilization, and what he framed as the historic ending of child sacrifice by Christian Europe. He tied that to the protection of women and unborn life. Parts of the speech warrant close examination, what assumptions underlie his claims, what history is being simplified or misconstrued, and what implications this has for indigenous peoples and for public discourse. What he said, excerpted. Quote, "Let me just make an observation. If you go to historical archaeological sites where there were brothels and the two oldest businesses in the world are gambling and prostitution, so there were brothels even in very ancient civilizations." Quote ending. Quote, "If you go back to ancient brothels and dig up the bones of the women who were working in these places, you will very often find a lot of children who were buried with them." End of quote. Quote, "One of the points I made is that when the settlers came to the New World, they found a very widespread child sacrifice. There is a reason why Christian civilization ended the practice of child sacrifice all over the world. I believe that we should try to be protecting every unborn life. I would never say that anyone's right to life should be sacrificed." End of quote. Breakdown and critical commentary. Quote, "Brothels, the two oldest businesses in the world, are gambling and prostitution." End of quote. Before European contact, brothels did not exist in indigenous societies. Organized prostitution emerged through colonization when European patriarchal and militarized systems introduced sexual commerce and trafficking to imply otherwise reverses history and erases the colonial violence that targeted indigenous women and girls. Light to bring, when exploitation exists across cultures, it was colonialism that industrialized it in indigenous lands. Quote, "If you go back to ancient brothels, you will very often find a lot of children who were buried with them." End of quote. The association between women, children, and brothel burials is speculative and misleading. In North America, the bones of indigenous children unearthed beneath churches and boarding schools are not relics of immorality. They are evidence of Christian colonial violence. If Vance wishes to speak of bones buried with women and children, he should begin with those graves the U.S. and Church still refuse to acknowledge. Quote, "When the settlers came to the New World, they found a very widespread child sacrifice. Christian civilization ended the practice of child sacrifice all over the world." End of quote. Yes, some Mesoamerican civilizations, the Mexica, Maya, and Inca, and others, practiced ritual sacrifice. Yet these were sacred acts of reciprocity, often voluntary, meant to sustain life, rain, and the sun. By calling this barbaric, Vance erases the spirituality behind it, while glorifying colonization, which replaced ritual sacrifice with state-sanctioned genocide. The Geneva Convention and the reality of war. Vance frames Christian civilization as the moral savior of humanity, but even today, Christian majority nations violate the very moral law they claim to uphold. Under the Third Geneva Convention, signatory nations, including the U.S., are legally bound to treat prisoners of war, POWs, humanely. Yet American history records multiple incidents where the U.S. military killed prisoners of war and civilians. In World War II, the Biscari Massacre in 1943, U.S. soldiers executed 73 unarmed Italian and German prisoners of war in Sicily. The Shenogne Massacre in 1945, U.S. forces killed around 80 German prisoners of war in Belgium after orders to, quote, "take no prisoners." In the Iraq War, Abu Ghraib prison in 2003 to 2004, detainees were tortured and killed by U.S. personnel. The Haditha Massacre in 2005, U.S. Marines murdered 24 unarmed Iraqi civilians, including women and children. These documented crimes prove that the Christian civilization Vance praises has never ceased to sacrifice the innocent, only changed its methods. Christian civilization ended the practice of child sacrifice. Fact check, it did not. Christianity's central image, the crucifixion, is itself a human sacrifice. Later crusades, inquisitions, and forced conversions extended that pattern worldwide, and the unmarked graves beneath church schools show that even children continue to die for the faith of others. I believe that we should try to be protecting every unborn life. Vance's pro-life stance rests on a selective Christian morality. The same church he praises oversaw forced sterilizations of indigenous women well into the 1970s. Even the Bible is not absolute on this issue. Numbers 5:11 through 31 describes a ritual that induces miscarriage, an early form of abortion law within ancient Israel. If life is sacred, then so is the truth about whose lives Christian civilization has destroyed. Why this matters. When public figures rewrite indigenous history to defend political theology, they revive the myth that colonization brought morality to savage lands. Such rhetoric still influences policy, education, and public perception of indigenous sovereignty. If the goal is to truly value life, it must begin with truth, acknowledging the lives taken under the same civilization now being celebrated. Concluding thoughts, Vance's speech was not just inaccurate, it was a continuation of centuries-old propaganda that framed Christianity as the sole source of morality and indigenous peoples as in need of saving. From an indigenous perspective, whose history is being told and who's being silenced? How can we talk about the sanctity of life while Christian institutions still hide children beneath their floors? It is right to advocate for the dignity of women, children, and the unborn life, but it must be done with truth and accountability. Christian civilization did not end sacrifice, it simply changed who was being sacrificed. Thank you for listening and watching the audio version of Itom Jiawai Reports. We hope you have a great day, and remember, history does not need to be rewritten to serve politics. It just needs to be told honestly. Tuwa liel san chimioko etesiavu, liel sapo en chimak. Chukola. I'll see you next time.